Monday, October 11th, Columbus Day, or Indigenous Peoples Day, as we like to call it these days, if we're going to be more politically correct. Excuse me. And Columbus Day is a perfect day to introduce the topic of white Christianity, our topic for this week. Because the creation of Columbus Day was an illustration of late 1800s thinking about black and white dominance in America. So we'll start with that. In 1892, President Benjamin Harrison declared October 11th as Columbus Day. Why did he do that? Before that, Columbus was not generally thought of as a great American hero or the discoverer of the Americas, although there was all this knowledge about his voyages and Nina Pinta and the Santa Maria, so on. But the problem with Columbus was he was an Italian. He was employed by the Spanish, and he never came to North America. He came to the West Indies and South America, and he did great damage and insults to the indigenous peoples of those areas, and introduced colonial ideas and slavery and lots of diseases that the indigenous people were not immune to. But just after the period of Reconstruction, when particularly in the South, people were cracking down on black folks who were getting too uppity for their business, and a lot of black folks were moving away from the South and away from the intense labor jobs that they could get. And Italian immigrants were coming into this country. Now, the Italians are a swarthy people. They are darker-skinned, olive-skinned, they like to say. They're Mediterranean in culture and climate and in looks and skin color. And they came to America, and they were willing to take the really low-paying labor jobs, and they were stuck in ghettos, and they were considered low-class folks. They weren't really white Americans. There was a big uprising at one point when people were mistreating the Italians, and at some point, and the Italians rose up and protested. A mob came in and hauled 11 Italian immigrants, protesters, out of the jails and lynched them because they were considered the equivalent of black folks in those days. The fly in that ointment was, in those days, the country of Italy was a very powerful European country. And Italy, discovering that America was abusing their former citizens, the folks coming from there, raised a ruckus, withdrew diplomatic relations with the United States, and demanded that President Harrison do something about it. In order to salve their concerns, President Harrison decided to create Columbus Day to honor a great Italian. And then the myth about Columbus began to grow up, and the Italians began to tell how wonderful and brilliant he was to sail the seas and go into the areas where they thought he would drop off the edge of the world, or there were nothing but monsters, and actually came and discovered what he thought was going to be China, but indeed was the Western Hemisphere. That's the reason they call it the West Indies. is in India. So Columbus, and the creation of Columbus Day helped the Italians gain some status in America. In an article, the reason I saw this was in a Times article about a year ago, October 12th in New York Times. And the headline was, How Italians Became White. This complete whitewash of the Italian group, Italian human beings, who are human beings after all, but became more higher status Americans because of the myth of Christopher Columbus. And they were able to move into higher echelons of American society. It's worth noting in this Columbus Day and in the day that we're beginning to discuss white Christianity, and particularly white Anglo Saxon or Protestant evangelical Christianity, and that is that it was much preferable to hold that the Italians, who were a lighter skinned people, immigrants and formerly enslaved folks from Africa, that it was an anti-black move to create Columbus Day. It's appropriate now that people are beginning to say, let's call it Indigenous Peoples Day, and remember the fact that Columbus didn't discover America. It was here all along. And the European arrogance and exceptionalism that Kelly Brown Douglas talks about was that it ain't nothing until we discover it. And then America, the English and the Portuguese and the Spanish came into the Western Hemisphere, colonialized it using their great colonial powers that we talked about with regard to indigenous African religions. Excuse me. So the colonialism and then the complete the takeover of Indian lands, Native American lands, and the driving of those folks out farther and farther into the least preferable, least accommodating areas of America, to the great Midwest and West, and Oklahoma became Indian territory, and New Mexico and so on. Those areas were where those folks were sent by force. There is a new movement about, I don't know how new, and I have only been recently made aware of it, and that is called Land Back. And it's parallel to the reparations idea of what America probably should owe the black folks for their hundreds of years of oppression. They're saying, let's give back land that all of it actually belonged to Native Americans, but if we can identify pieces that clearly could be turned back over to nations, the Native American nations, and let them have it back. Presbyterian Church has turned over some property in New York State, for example, to a Native tribe because it was theirs originally, and we've been calling it ours. Recently, last few years, I've been working in Oklahoma, and every place I went to speak to a group of Presbyterians in Oklahoma, I reminded them that their land originally belonged to Choctaw and I forgot the other, and gave them a little history of who that land actually had belonged to in the first place. That's the kind of thinking that gets away from the dominant cultural theme of America, which is whiteness is all that counts. Whiteness is the dominant. And white Christianity, actually those two terms are securely interlinked. You can't separate Christianity from whiteness in the way these people think about our culture, our America. So happy Columbus Day, happy Indigenous Peoples Day. Let's talk a little bit about this, the beginnings of white Christianity in America. And Kelly Brown Douglas in chapter 1, that is your assignment for this week, talks about the coming of the people that we celebrate as the first people who created America the way it ought to be. The Puritans and the Pilgrims. They came on ships from England. Who were these people? These were anti-Church of England, anti-Reformation protesters, separatists, people who were even more radical than the reformers, the people who got away from the Catholic Church in England and in Europe, more radical than the Presbyterians and more radical than the Methodists. They felt that when England took on a Protestant perspective and the king became the head of the Church of England instead of the Pope, but they didn't give up Catholicism. The church was still high church, it still used the same kind of mass, it still had priests, and the whole thing. And these Puritans and Pilgrims and other separatists believed the church had not gone far enough. It was still corrupt. It was still full of Catholicism, of papism. So they wanted to get away. They wanted to get away from the king who was running the church. They wanted to get away from people who were saying they were the heretics, and you want to get rid of them. They were wanting to be gotten rid of. So these were folks who were into that religious idea. But they were also, here again, religious and political notions kind of came together in this group as well. They were also Democrats. That is to say, they believed in a pure democracy. England didn't have a democracy. They had a parliamentary government, much more monarchical then than it is now, but still run by a king or a queen. They didn't believe in that. They were pure Democrats. Where did they get this? This is where Kelly Brown Douglas talks about the pure Anglo Saxon blood of the pure English. I want you to think about looking up the Anglo Saxons. And there you can see what Kelly Brown Douglas talks about them, but dig into it a little more. The story is that they took their mythology, their sense of who they were, from the writings of a Roman philosopher named Tacitus. And Tacitus wrote Germania, which described these pure democratic peoples of the woods of northern Germany, tribes who were very collaboratively governed. Everybody had a chance and a say. They were very peace-loving. They were separating themselves from everybody else. And they had, here's the ticker, they had pure white people's blood. And that pure blood is the source of that drive toward democracy and to religious purity and to whiteness as a piece of who we are as Christians. The pure blood. They carried to America those ideas, along with what they didn't get rid of when they were becoming pure. They didn't get rid of colonialism. They understood themselves as colonialists. They came to America to colonize this new continent, to make it a place that they called the New Promised Land. They believed that and remember the whole business of creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing? They gave the Europeans a sense that the creation was so different from God. It was fallen, it was corrupt, it was ugly and not great, and it needed to be purified and reformed according to the European ideal. And of course, that ideal was filled with a whole business of hierarchical dominance and patriarchy and whiteness and a color line, so we knew who were the real people, their pure blood. They thought of themselves as the chosen people coming to the promised land. And the other piece of colonialism they brought with them was the whole notion of property. This new land is now our property. We claim it. We put the English flag on it. We claim it for king and country and Jesus. And Jesus, God wants us to turn this country into the great white promised land, the city on the hill, the nation that is so good and wonderful. Alabaster cities, and so forth. These are the Anglo Saxon peoples who are the center story of America. And it is an exclusive story. That means that only white folks have a real shot at that success in the story. They're the only ones who really should have any say in what happens in this country. They are the ones who are the true Americans. Now, I gave you a paper on the module for this week called The Sources of White Supremacy, in which I have laid out a whole series of historical ideas and doctrines that have developed down through the last 2,000 years to create what has become the white Anglo-Saxon supremacist, exceptionalist, we are the ones who make America what it is. That has become so blatant these days in the current administration of the president and in the campaign that's going on. By the way, did you notice that the president the other day, in speaking in Wisconsin to an almost all white group of folks, said, you have good blood. You're the pure blood. It's like a racehorse. You're the and he didn't use pure, but he's talking about blood. And it is that Anglo-Saxon notion of that bloodland passed down from the Germans into England, then on into America. That's what we're talking about, is white supremacy. So I want you to look at that paper. I want you to study it. It's a few pages long. I want you to notice particularly words that there is a number of concepts and ideas there that tie into ideas of God. The first one is supersessionism, and that is, which really basically says the people of Israel, the Jews, did not follow their biblical warrants that said Jesus was going to come and become the Savior and the Messiah. They'd rejected Jesus, and therefore they're no longer the chosen people. The Christians are. By the time this idea of God's choosing became really enforced, the main place where people were Christian was in Europe. Asia had diminished as a place of Christian emphasis. Africa was diminishing, having only a few places left because the Muslims had come in and taken over so much of it by the end of the first millennium, by 1000 of the Common Era. So they were Europeans. We Europeans are the chosen people. in that period of time, there was also erasure, in which the art and architecture of the time starts making all of the saints of Christianity look white, even those African ones, like Augustine. We talked about Augustine. They even erased, so they just painted over the sculptures and the paintings. They also erased the possibility of women as leadership, by the way. There were women leaders in the early church, and they took the pictures of those and basically they put beards on them so that nobody would know that actually women had an equal chance in the church. So then, as nations developed, they developed a nationalism, and they developed power, and they developed boats, and they could start sailing the seven seas, and they could build a military power, and they could colonialize. And the notion of colonialism, where they could capture and extract the natural resources and capture the land and dominate it, take the natural resources and take the people away as slaves. Those three pieces of colonialism were based on this whole notion of European exceptionalism. We're going to make the world better, because those actually, there was some writing that James Baldwin quoted of the French saying, well, those people aren't using those natural resources, all those nice minerals in the ground. We might as well have them, because we're liberating it. So that colonialism, what they called called the doctrine of discovery. We discovered it, therefore it's ours. The whole notion of color becomes an important piece. How do we know which people we can take? Because the lighter the skin, the better they are. The darker the skin, less human. They take that out of Genesis as well, where it said, this is a misreading of Genesis. They said God created light over against the darkness, and God called the light good. And they said, you see, whiteness is good, darkness, blackness is bad. That's not what the Bible says, but that's what Europeans decided. So all of that gets translated through the Anglo Saxons into the Pilgrims and the Puritans and the other folks who came and settled America as a white people's country. Laws and constitution and so forth were all set up to make that very clear. So what I want you to do before now and Wednesday, when we'll have class, and we'll talk more about Anglo-Saxon white Christianity and the ways how we understand it and how it fits into, and the question again, is that God that the white folks are worshiping the same God as what the black folks are worshiping? It's a very important question. And remember, what we're talking about in this class is the ideas of God. So Africans had their ideas of God. Black Christians in America have their ideas of God. White Christians have their ideas of God. They are very different ideas. My question is, does that mean they're very different gods? But that helps us get the distinction between the reality of a mystery, a transcendence, a holiness that nobody can fully understand, and the ideas that the way the people tell the stories and create their doctrines about. So I want you to become aware of the Anglo-Saxons. I want you to become aware of these terms that are in my paper on the history of the sources of white supremacy. Think about what is colonialism and I have this other thing, and look up the color code, the racial color codes that dominated the thinking of so much of the first few hundred years of America. When we're talking about white Christianity now, it's very easy to make some generalizations about all of this. Not all white Christians are the same, as not all black Christians are the same. There's a simple distinction between the progressive white Christians, who are less likely to hold a very exclusive, dominant, and thinking only of white folks' religion. That's kind of the tradition I come out of. And the more evangelical, conservative Christians who believe and don't distinguish between their idea of God and God, their idea of what this country should be and the way it actually is, and who are tied into their doctrines that they can't listen to new stories and new ideas. We're beginning to look at this whole process of how American Christianity, white Christianity, has shaped the way we are in the world. A lot of that is playing itself out now on the streets of Louisville. It's playing out on the streets of other cities around the country. It's playing out in the campaign for the president and vice president. We have a woman of color who's black and South Asian, mixed race, and she's getting all kinds of stuff from the whiteness brigade that are trying to protect America from that kind of incursion. The story that if you're a darker skinned person, you don't have as many rights. You may not even have the right to live in a white America. Those are assumptions that are playing themselves out right now. Even if you're a protester, standing up for justice and truth, theoretically American ideals of democracy, you are considered an enemy. You're considered the bad guys because you're confronting the great dominant theme of American democracy, that is, it's got to be white and the white people are in charge. That's the kind of stuff we'll be looking at on the class on Wednesday. I hope you'll be doing your reading. I hope you'll be doing some thinking and looking up and asking questions on your own. I hope you're getting caught up on last week's assignments, and we're thinking about moving ahead. Don't forget to be thinking about your term paper that will be due 3 weeks from now, actually. Pretty close to it. So begin working on those things. If you have questions, email me, text me, call me, and we can work on it. I will see you, most of you anyway, at 9 o'clock on Wednesday morning, and we'll talk this over.